African.
May 25th is a very important date in African liberation, and it is indeed celebrated as such by Africans the whole world over. Where does it originate from? Indeed, it originates especially from the declaration at the midnight of the independence of Ghana on the 6th of March, the eve of 6th of March 1957, when the Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah declared,
"We dedicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent."
Africa's struggle or national independence was arduous. Men and women of African descent from all over the world, including Field Marshal Muthoni of Kenya, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Josina Muthemba Machel, Patrice Lumumba, dedicated their lives to the heroic struggles of the people of Africa to rid themselves of oppressive and exploitative colonialism. On the eve of Ghana's independence on March 6, 1957, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, founder of the modern Republic of Ghana, declared that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of the African continent.
Of course, this declaration is situated within the context of the unity of the Pan Africanist struggle, which at the 5th Pan African Congress in Manchester, 1945, gathered together a whole host of African liberation fighters to plan for the independence and liberation struggle for Africa, which was then almost totally dominated by European powers. So the declaration was the expression of both the internal and external foreign policy of Ghana. The internal policy being that we have liberated ourselves from colonialism, and in order for us to safeguard our independence and our sovereignty, there was the need for us to help our brother African countries who are under colonial rule to also become like us, that is to become independent countries, so that we could advance the project of African unity.
An effective and a collaborative and a common action was needed as an attempt to confront the forces of imperialism and exploitation that was taking place on the African continent. So when and how did we get to this stage? our human development as Africans or black people. That for more than 400 years, black people, the sons and daughters of the African people were kidnapped and shipped over across the Atlantic. Until today, we are still recovering from that effect. After that, we were fixed with our colonial, settler colonialism and apartheid. So we needed to resist it again, just as we fought our enslavement. So we're confronted with more than 150 years of colonialism, apartheid, and settler colonialism. So Africa's response to this was to fight this, but this one was happening individually at the various levels of the African people, like the Liberation movement. So for example, the CPP in Ghana was battling the British at that single level. The PIGC in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde were also battling the Portuguese at that level. So the formation of the OAU brought about a coordinated action against these forces of exploitation and then imperialism.
Why African unity? Because due to the balkanization of the continent, the division of the continent into almost 53 countries, being attached into the apron strings of their colonial masters, we didn't have any economic connections, we didn't have political connections, and our social connections have been disrupted. Indeed, even at the border, which wherever it straddles the middle of one tribe, those tribes were divided into French-speaking and English-speaking and Portuguese-speaking, etc., etc. So it was very important. Kwame Nkrumah didn't only do the declaration of our independence being meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of the African continent, but went ahead on April 15th to host the first conference of independent African countries, where 9 independent African countries participated. Those 9 African independent countries included Ghana, Guinea, Liberia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and of course there was the representative from Cameroon, which was yet to become independent, from the United People's Congress. These countries participated in the first conference of independent African countries, and it was held in Accra on April 15, 1958. April 15 was actually declared as Africa Freedom Day. Later on in that same year, in December, the All Africa People's Conference, which hosted all the liberation groups within the continent of Africa, and even groups from the West Indies participated. And that conference was also held in Accra to plan how to help these countries to achieve independence and to fight for national liberation. Subsequently, other meetings were held by various groupings, the Casablanca group, the Monrovia group, the Brazzaville group. And these three blocks met on the May 25th in Addis Ababa, 1963, in order to form the Organization of African Unity. The Organization of African Unity has been very instrumental in uniting Africa. They could have gone much further, as Osajifo wanted, but through the Liberation Committee, they were able to help in the fight, the ANC, in its fight against apartheid South Africa and bring it down, to fight against apartheid South Africa by helping SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization, for the independence of Namibia and for the independence of Angola and all the Portuguese, the so-called Portuguese African countries, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome and Principe, and other African countries which were under colonial rule.
As you know, the Organization of African Unity was established in 1963. And at that time, there were still African countries that were under foreign domination. So one of the cardinal principles of the then OAU was freedom of the then colonial or other African territories still under foreign domination, many of which happened to be in southern Africa. This week, or was it a few weeks ago, Sierra Leone celebrated 60 years of independence. So in much of Western and Eastern Africa, independence was achieved from about the early 1960s, 61, 62, 63, and the like. But we had these territories, mostly those who had settler populations that were still not free, and which from all indications were not going to be free anytime soon. So the OAU committed itself to ensuring the liberation of all African territories from colonial or settler domination. Towards that end, it set up an African Liberation Committee, which was headquartered in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And that was significant because Tanzania became known as later as a frontline state. So countries like Tanzania, Zambia, they were bordering those territories. And you had the African Liberation Committee that was headquartered in Tanzania. Basically with the objective of coordinating and supporting the countries, the movements in their struggle for liberation. And Tanzania became a hub of activity in the liberation struggle. It hosted reception centers for exiles and refugees from those countries. Which were these countries? Now Zimbabwe, Rhodesia then, Southwest Africa, Namibia, and of course South Africa and Mozambique and Angola. So the African Liberation Committee had it had a council of foreign ministers because they were the ones who would implement the decisions of the committee. And of course, it also had the secretariat, the administrative general secretary, and then representatives of different countries. So Ghana was not a member. In fact, Ghana disagreed with that whole decision. So Ghana was not a member, but countries like Guinea, Senegal, Egypt were members of the African Liberation Committee.
Before the founding of the OAU, all of these little actions were taking place individually, and that was not, and that it kind of lacked capacity to make any meaningful impact, because imperialism was one, and it was attacking the African people at that global level of might and power. So we needed to get together to fight it. So the OAU brought about a coordinated support for all the freedom fighters. There was also a liberation committee that was formed to provide some kind of assistance, like arms and other logistics for freedom fighters that were engaged in this exercise. Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the liberation struggle in Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, as I mentioned earlier, mentioned some of these examples, even though at some point that he admitted that they were not enough, but I think they were helpful enough to make an impact for their liberation process.
what it did was that it tried to ensure that the liberation movement was supported financially and materially. The decision had been taken that OAU member countries should provide 1% of their national budgets towards the liberation struggle. But this was not an easy decision, and most of the time, very few countries were able to actually provide 1% of their national budgets. So as a result, there was a lot of dependence on friendly foreign countries, the then Soviet Union, China, the then Yugoslavia, etc. They were and even Cuba, they were the countries that provided a lot of support to the liberation movement. What was happening also was that in many countries you wouldn't have a single liberation movement, you would have different liberation movements. So part of the job of the African Liberation Committee was to try to reconcile the differences, you know, and sometimes it was very difficult because which of the liberation movements do you support? At most of the time they were trying to support one liberation movement because it was expensive and also it was more efficient to have one. And this is where the different ideological leanings of the countries came in, because you'd find one country supporting a particular, not just any country, some of the countries which were members of the African Liberation Committee supporting one liberation movement over another. A third activity of the African Liberation Committee was also was mostly diplomatic, ensuring that liberation movements got recognized and supported. You know, the United Nations had the UN Decolonization Committee. So this was you know what the UN is. So to be able to get a liberation movement recognized by the UN Decolonization Committee was a very big step. And in fact, the African Liberation Committee managed to get the UN Decolonization Committee to have a meeting in Dar es Salaam in 1965, which was a big boost to the liberation movement. And diplomatically, it also tried to isolate those foreign countries that were dominating Africa. So countries like Portugal, when in Portugal for the Angola and Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde and Mozambique, and then also when Rhodesia declared independence unilaterally in 1965, the African Liberation Committee was trying to get countries not to recognize that declaration of independence because it was still white minority rule. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room was South Africa, how to ensure that the apartheid regime was not recognized. That was very difficult because the apartheid regime had very firm support. Some of the big powers like the Britain, France, and the United States. But it did a good job. It managed to isolate even South Africa and, for example, the Scandinavian countries and even Japan. They started disinvesting in South Africa. I think that one of the big things that helped the apartheid regime to finally crumble, in addition to the liberation movement, was the whole campaign of disinvestment, that if you go and invest in South Africa, you are propping up apartheid. So that was a diplomatic offensive that succeeded, and more. Eventually, even, you know, you had a lot of banks and corporations, even in the US and Britain and co, which started disinvesting in these countries. The African Liberation Committee also pursued its efforts through the Commonwealth and through the Francophonie, the group of Francophone countries. It was not always easy. For instance, in 1971, the then president of Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, and the Prime Minister of Ghana, Dr. Bouzia, they were trying to suggest that African countries should dialogue with South Africa, but that was not a popular stand, you know. So the African Liberation Committee was behind it, trying to scuttle all these efforts and to make sure that there was more or less a united front, and that the total goal was liberation without any kind of compromises. So if you look at the subsequent independence of different African countries that were under foreign domination or colonial rule, like first Guinea and Cape Verde in 1974, the African Liberation Committee was quite effective in of course, it's not that the African Liberation Committee was not doing the fighting. The liberation movements were there, but they needed all that kind of diplomatic support. So in 1974, Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau became independent, and then you had Mozambique becoming independent shortly afterwards. Angola was a little murkier because you had both the MPLA and then UNITA. And UNITA had a lot of support from the US, but Cuba and South Africa were very decisive in supporting Angola to become independent in 1979, although civil war broke out almost immediately. And then we had Zimbabwe, where again you had ZANU and ZAPU and all those kinds of movements, but eventually Zimbabwe became independent under Mugabe. And then you had Namibia also becoming independent. So eventually it was South Africa that was the big elephant once again. And but with the anti-apartheid struggle ramping up and the support, it became almost like a global struggle, you know. Everybody was campaigning against it, that is investments, the liberation struggle. Then South Africa attained majority black rule in 1994. So after that, it was like the African Liberation Committee's work was finished. Okay, so eventually a resolution was taken in 1994 to disband the committee, and it no longer exists. Now, I guess the closest to it in the current African Union is the Peace and Security Council, but after 94, its mandate ended. You could say that, you could ask, does that mean that all of Africa was free by 94? There is the Vexed case of the Polisario Liberation Front, which is contested very heavily by Morocco, and which has some support. There are factions supporting. The Polisario Front is recognized by the African Union, but it is a very vexed question, you know. And technically, when Spain withdrew, then you did not have that foreign domination, although there is the question of Morocco and its role in Polisario, in the Sahrawi well, the Polisario Front declared the Sahrawi Republic, but there's a lot of contestation going on, etc. So, in terms of the issues or the problems, there was always the issue of funding, whether the movements were getting the necessary support, and clearly it was never enough, and they had to rely very much on the Eastern Bloc of countries and China and Cuba for support. There was always also the question of national interests, you know, who to support, and how, you know, for instance, Malawi, for instance, was also a frontline state, but it determined that it was too close to South Africa. Its economy was too dependent on South Africa, so it wouldn't take the risk. Whereas countries like Zambia and Tanzania, which were also frontline states, took the risk and were punished. On the other hand, a country like Tanzania played a very big role in providing. In fact, in Tanzania, in a place called Morogoro, they had camps for the liberation movement, for the freedom fighters, where they practiced, etc., and they trained their troops, you know. And so to that extent, to the extent that the goal that the OAU set for the African Liberation Committee to coordinate support to the liberation movements in order to end foreign domination and foreign control of territories, one could say that that was very much achieved. And after '94, it was decided that, you know, attention should be paid to the economic liberation and economic ascendancy of Africa, which is still very much a work in progress, as you all know.
I joined SWAPO in order to liberate my motherland, Namibia.
In thinking about Africa's liberation, I think we have to think about it in terms of different phases. Africans fought against slavery, they fought against colonialism, they've been fighting against imperialism and exploitation since many African countries gained independence. And today, in many African countries, citizens are fighting against dictatorship, corruption, and no figure who was leading the chants during the Sudanese uprising. And people started asking that, how come that we saw women at the forefront of these struggles? And the reason why it was so striking that there were these women was that, not because women had not been involved in struggles, but many people had overlooked the involvement of women. So it was almost like a flash of light to see these women actually leading the struggles, clearly key strategists in the struggles. So it calls on us to look back into our history, and our history is replete with everyday acts of heroism by women against colonialism, and some unusual acts. So for example, there were the spirit mediums in the Nyabingi movement in Uganda, and this movement was led by women, and they were very engaged in the spiritual aspects of liberation. They became a force which organized some very important struggles in the anti-colonial struggles, not just in Uganda, but in Tanzania and in Rwanda. If you take Mau Mau, women were very, very active in the Mau Mau struggle. Again, performing armed struggle, performing some of the most critical functions of social reproduction that have been left to women by society, the cooking, and looking after wounded soldiers and so on. And then if you look at the liberation movements in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique and in Angola, women took up arms. Also in Zimbabwe, women were very active in the armed struggle. And even in those armed struggles, they continued to perform all these acts of social reproduction. At the same time, they also took up arms. And in movements that recognize the leadership of women, it's arguable that those movements basically did better than the ones that did not. Take the example of Ghana, in our own anti-colonial struggle. One writer about the anti-colonial struggle, C.L.R. James, said that one market woman was worth 12 Achimota graduates. And he was paying tribute to those market women who were very key in mobilizing for the CPP in the anti-colonial struggle. But for the work they did, the liberation of Ghana from the clutches of colonialism might have taken longer. And the unfortunate thing is that they are not given enough credit for the work they do. And it's been said that a society that does not recognize its heroes is bound not to do well. And so thinking about Africa's liberation, honoring these women who laid down their lives, supported the struggles of entire generations, took up arms themselves, and basically brought up a new generation in the midst of crisis. It's very key to our becoming a strong force for liberation for our future.
That in my case, Prempeh College, were excited about being involved in the revolution to free our own society. So it was a major thing for us to be involved, and we all had to be involved. We have to also take the situation during that time. In 1949, two major things happened for us, and at least for me. One of them was the positive action, which was enunciated by Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. We as the young people were all taken by positive action, which we felt will help us liberate our country. Some of us also were following what was happening in China. And the fascination of China was the great march, which finally culminated in the victory of the Long March, as it was called. And Mao Zedong came in 1949 to be the leader of China, which has since then grown to be a major world power, which it wasn't at that period of time. So 1949 was a significant year in terms of our own development, in terms of our own advancement, in terms of our revolutionary matters, and also support for those fighting against imperialism and so on. So this made us grow up thinking of all the fights which we had to do, first to liberate our country, also to help liberation of other countries. And so it was a very exciting period for me anyway. And I took part wholly in this exercise, in this adventure, if one may call it so. Furthermore, after I left Ghana, I was also thrown into the situation of revolution in Europe. And I was at one point General Secretary of WASU, and WASU's advocacy and support for countries in West Africa, basically, and also other countries, for their independence and for their human rights. My own personal involvement in some of these things was that I became General Secretary of WASU. And as General Secretary of WASU, there was a lot to do in this enterprise about development of our society, changing the stage of our governance, getting our independence and so on. And so everything done was in advancement of our own independence, which was paramount. In 1959, I was in Vienna, and this was the famous World Youth Organization, which met to try and advance the youth of the world in their independence and so on. 59 was interesting because this association, which all the countries which met in Vienna were fighting for human rights, they were fighting for independence and so on. And one significant thing was the historic Cuban revolution succeeded. So all these young Cubans came, and we worked in Vienna for mankind. That is something which I had the opportunity to participate in because of my role as a General Secretary of WASU and so on. Furthermore, I became the President of Committee of African Organization, we call COW. And this also, Nkrumah, was significant in the help that Africans must fight for their rights. And this is not just say by mouth, he did it by action. A house in Britain was bought called Africa Unity House. And in Africa Unity House, we had under the auspices of Africa, we had not only students' unions, we had youth movements, workers' unions, liberation movement, like ANC and all these various organizations. So it was a period, for our period, was a period of struggle. And if you were in there, you either struggled or you stayed behind. Those of us who felt that the struggle is for us and that we should do whatever we can, continued. In my days at Committee of African Union, we happened to make some kind of engagements with people. One of them, which for me was significant, was inviting Malcolm X to come and speak to the Africans before he was assassinated. And the role he played in America and also among the black people to try and bring black people everywhere together was immense. So that was another period. So for me, I think the revolution has always been part of me. It is still part of me in terms of whatever we see. Sometimes we do not talk. We just see things going and we can advise here. But our past and history of attachment, for instance, I knew Che Guevara well. Malcolm X was my friend, and all these people, because of the role I played as first the General Secretary of WASU and also as a President of the Committee of African Organization. So I can say without any fear of contradiction that we did our bit. So for me, revolution is necessary. We will have revolution. It has to be permanent revolution, because if you lose sight, things change. And you have to be attentive and look ahead. So when we think of Africa Union Day, which we are going to celebrate, one looks at things as they've happened, looks at what we can change, looks at the things which will move us forward, because whether we like it or not, our situation at the moment is not the best. And so we have to keep on struggling. And struggling is part of what will give us our independence, will give us our freedom, and will make us feel like we are human beings. So we have to struggle.
Notre pays produit suffisamment de quoi nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant, d'assister. Nous devons mettre de côté ces aides par notre grande production. Il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également ses volontés. Nous consommons que ce que nous contrôlons.
African Liberation Day is very important because it brings together the whole of the African world. Why the need for it? There was the need for it because from 1471, when the first white man stepped foot at Elimina or Edna in what later on became the Gold Coast, and of course after the papal bulls were proclaimed by Pope Clement of the Catholic Church, Africa and Africans have been systematically exploited and denigrated. They were even in the white supremacist ideology made to look like they were mere apes. Some of them were even put in cages and in zoos in New York at the exhibition. So that systematic denigration of the African demanded that the Africans became aware of themselves. After the slave trade, that's the Atlantic slave trade, there was also colonialism. And the liberation struggle, which started in earnest or continued from the resistance in the 1940s, culminated in the glorious liberation or independence of Ghana on the 6th of March 1957. And that was the harbinger of African Liberation Day. And it behoves on all of us, all Africans, all lovers of Africa, to come together because it epitomizes human values, the values of freedom, the values of being able to manage one's own affairs, the values of truth, the values of honesty. That is what African Liberation Day represents. It also represents that Africans should stop economic exploitation and be able to develop their countries and help their citizens to access the various basic necessities of life.
The agenda of the independence movement to struggle for a situation in which Africans have the power to elect their own leaders has been subverted by corrupt and irresponsible leaders throughout Africa. These leaders who are trampling on the rights of their people, these leaders who are rigging elections, these leaders who are facilitating the thievery of African resources by imperialism, do not represent the interests of the African people and indeed are not the choice of the African people. We need to intensify the struggle for the total liberation of the African continent, to give meaning to our independence by taking over the control of our resources and by exploiting these resources for the benefit of the African people. We need to intensify the struggle for freedom in Africa by linking up with all the internationalist forces engaged in similar struggle, by linking up with all the internationalist forces which are gearing their efforts towards the liberation of the working people from the clutches of exploitation, from the clutches of oppression, and from the clutches of degrading labor. Today, as we look around Africa, it is obvious that the AU or the African Union no longer represents the interests and aspirations of the African people. The AU, and indeed its leaders, represent the surge of neoliberalism throughout Africa. The surge of neoliberalism throughout Africa, which insists on the privatization of state enterprises, which insists on the limitation of access to education and other social services such as education, housing, and health. The neoliberal order, which has led to the massive devaluations of African currencies. Today, many of our leaders are still not able to break away from the colonial yoke and are tied to the colonial metropolis, to the extent that French-speaking African countries keep all of their foreign reserves in the Central Bank of France and borrow their own money and pay interest on their own money. The struggle for the total liberation of the African people ought to be embraced by all of us, men and women, young and old. All the peoples of Africa need to be mobilized in this big struggle, which will finally lead to our liberation from slavery. The African people are no longer carted to Europe, the West Indies, and North America in ships to labor for the accumulation of capital and the entrenchment of the capitalist system. But today, we still continue to labor, not for ourselves, but to entrench the capitalist system. This capitalist system is a system of exploitation. This capitalist system is a system which enables the capitalist powers, the multinational corporations and so on, to siphon our resources, to enhance their system of exploitation and so on. And we need to smash the capitalist system as part of our effort to liberate ourselves from the clutches of exploitation. We have no option than to go back to the resolutions of the 1945 Manchester Conference, in which the forebears of African freedom gathered in Manchester and called for the building of the United States of Africa, and insisted that the United States of Africa need to be built under the banner of socialism. This is the only way for true and total African liberation. We in the Socialist Forum of Ghana, along with our comrades in the International People's Assembly, and along with all of our comrades all over the world, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Nigeria, in the Comoros, in Cape Verde, everywhere in the world, are united in this bold and heroic struggle of liberation from poverty, exploitation, and oppression. We will succeed.